All right. Hey guys, this is going to be the fourth video for chapter 10. And this is going to address the learning objective number 10, which is defining and identifying cross-sectional and longitudinal designs, um, which are the two kinds of developmental research designs, in case you're wondering, or if you haven't gotten that under wraps yet. And then the strengths and the weaknesses of each. So, um, remember that developmental research design, what that's referring to is changes in behavior that relate to age specifically. So, we've talked a lot about time-related studies, but developmental specifically is when the variable you're interested in is age. So the purpose of developmental research designs is to describe the relationship between age and other variables, whatever the variables are that you're interested in. An example would be how language ability changes with age. So how language ability changes, as a person ages, or between a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old or whatever. And then to study that, there are two ways that you can do that, two main ways. And there's those two, as I mentioned a second ago, are cross-sectional and longitudinal. Now, the cross-sectional, I can't talk today, is the one that we're going to discuss first. This one is when you are well, we already talked about that first bullet point. This is when you are studying several groups of individuals, different ages, at the same time. So it's basically like a snapshot in time, right? And so the different groups are measured only one time at one point in time, and then we compare. So that would be like if we surveyed or did some kind of research with 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 20-year-olds all at the same time. Like tomorrow we went and did this, or this week we went and did this, and we compared the 5-year-olds and the 10-year-olds. We compared them, so they're different groups, different ages, and you're comparing them all at the same time. So because it's at one point and there's different groups, this is an example of a between subjects, non-experimental design, specifically the non-equivalent group design. So you may think that this sounds a lot like a differential design that we talked about with the non-equivalent group design, but it is, but it's with age. And so when the variable that you're interested in is age, it is usually referred to as a cross-sectional design. It is still a between subjects, non-equivalent group, non-experimental design, but again, with age, it's usually referred to as cross-sectional. And so let me show you guys this figure real quick. This is a visual example of what the cross-sectional design looks like. So you see we have 3 separate groups here. Again, that between subjects component. There's a group of 40-year-olds, a group of 60-year-olds, and a group of 80-year-olds. Okay? So they're separate groups of people. We're measuring them all, at the same time. So be aware that the word cross-sectional, I did want to note on this real quick, is thrown around a lot of times when it doesn't necessarily mean a cross-sectional developmental research design. So sometimes they refer to surveys as cross-sectional, and that just means that they're putting people into different categories or subgroups. That doesn't mean that it's a cross-sectional developmental research design. So make sure when you see that, that you look a little further to see what they actually did in the study and what variables they were using, and was age one of those variables. Okay, so the strengths and weaknesses of the cross-sectional developmental design. The strengths are that obviously the data can be collected in a very short period of time, right? You're collecting it all at once. So the researcher can observe how behavior changes as people age without actually watching the people age, without actually having to wait for the participants to get older. So that 40-year-old group, you don't have to wait for that 40 years for them to be 80 years old to study them at 80. You can just grab a separate group of 80-year-olds and get that information that way. So obviously that requires less resources and less effort as well, because you don't have to follow these people as they're aging or anything like that. But as you can probably see from the slide, but also from the example I just gave, is that the weakness here is that there are other factors that can come into play here. The differences between the groups may have something to do, may have something else besides age, right? It may not just be age that is differentiating the groups. And one of the main examples of that is cohort effects or generational effects. And so what that means is if you're studying 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, they grew up in different eras and different times, and they experienced life differently just because of the time in which they were that age. And so um, the effects of the environment and of the history and of the world that they grew up in could have changed them in a way that has nothing to do with the fact that they're 20. It has more to do with the fact that they're 20 in that particular year, or that they were born and raised 20 years before, whereas the other group, the 40-year-olds or the 30-year-olds, they were born and raised in a different time 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And so that affected them, and that could change how they respond and how they behave. And that has nothing to do with their age. It has more to do with their environment and the way that they grew up. And so those are called cohort effects, because those are cohorts. 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, those are cohorts, or generational effects. And so the example your book gives is that if you study computer literacy in a cross-sectional way, it looks like computer literacy declines with age, because if you study 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 80-year-olds, it looks like computer literacy is declining with age, but that's not necessarily true. It's that those 80-year-olds did not grow up around as much technology as the 40-year-olds or 50-year-olds did. And so it is not necessarily that they are losing computer literacy as they get older. It's just that those groups grew up in a different time or a different era. And so they're different cohorts. And so a better way to study something like that would be our other type, which would be longitudinal. There's another example in your book that talks about IQ and age. There are a lot of studies out there that are cross-sectional that say that age declines, IQ declines as you age. But there are lots of longitudinal studies that say it does not. And so these studies disagree. And the reason for that is likely due to these cohort effects. It has nothing to do with age. And so if you're worried about cohort effects, the way to eliminate that is to study longitudinally, which means following the same group as they age. So it's the opposite of that snapshot. It is actually like a home movie instead of a snapshot. It is a longer term project. And so you would take those 40-year-olds that we talked about, and you would measure them at 40, and then at 50, and then at 60 and 70 and 80 and whatever. You would follow those same group of participants over time as they were aging. So you can see, if you're measuring the same group of participants multiple times, that is an example of a within subjects non-experimental design. And technically it is a pre-test post-test design that we just discussed in the last video, where the treatment, the quote treatment, air quotes around treatment, is age, right? The variable that you're interested in is age. So you measure them at 40, and then when you measure them at 50, the treatment that was in between, quote, treatment that was in between, was them aging, right? Age was the difference between the 40 and the 50-year-old measurement. And so, again, most people are not going to call this a pre-test post-test design. They're going to call it a longitudinal study, because that's what it is. They're studying people as they age. The distinction is not always clear between this and a time series design. The time series we talked about before in the last video was where you're measuring several measurements before treatment and then several measurements after treatment. Well, here the treatment, the aging is in between each observation point, right? And so it's really like an OXOXOX, right? And so while that may look different than the OOXOOO that we discussed with the time series design, the lines are kind of blurred there, right? Because at what point does it really show, which is which? An example that they give in your book is a study where they looked at children before and after the parents got a divorce. And you could argue that that's a longitudinal study because the way that they looked at the participants was over time. They studied them as they aged. They studied them from, when they were younger and all the way as they got older. And they wanted to study how their behavior changed. So it was longitudinal, but you could also argue that it was a time series design because they were interested in comparing their measurements before the divorce and after the divorce, which is that time series design where we're comparing multiple observations before X, before the treatment, which was the divorce in this situation, and then multiple measurements, observations after the divorce. And so, again, sometimes it's not really a clear distinction between the two, and it's really okay if a researcher calls it one or the other, because they are so similar. It just depends on what they are focusing on. So, for example, the author of that study, if they were focusing more on emphasizing the difference in the divorce that the divorce made in before and after the divorce, if that was their focus, then it would seem to be more of a time series design. They probably would have called it that. But if they were more interested in how the divorce itself affected them as they aged after the fact, then that they probably place more emphasis on the longitudinal aspect of the study. So again, it just kind of depends on the researcher. So the strengths and weaknesses, you probably already figured a lot of this out just from what we've talked about. But the strength, obviously, is that it eliminates those cohort and generation effects, right? We don't have those because we don't have cohorts. We don't have the generations. It's the same group of people over time. So we've gotten rid of that worry. It also helps assess individual behavioral changes over time. You don't get that with cross-sectional because there's different people in every group, right? So that within subjects part of it. The weaknesses, though, again, is the opposite of the strengths of the cross-sectional, where the cross-sectional doesn't take very much time or resources or effort. Longitudinal takes a lot. It's very time consuming, a lot more effort to keep track of these participants as they age and over time, to get them to come back and participate again each time, and all of that. A part of that is the participant attrition. So they may drop out of the study, they may die, they may get sick, whatever. And so that can create bias in your study if you end up with a lot less than you started with, or the people that dropped out for certain reasons, and the people that stayed for certain reasons. That may be a variable that could confound your research. So there's that. And then also, of course, the potential for practice effects is always something to be aware of within subjects, because they are being measured multiple times, and so they could get used to that being measured, and so then they could end up doing better each time, but that's just because of practice, not necessarily because of age. And so oh, and I just realized I forgot to show you the picture of the longitudinal developmental design, the picture. So you just saw the cross-sectional was the three separate groups of people, right? Well, this is that one circle, the one group of people, and we're measuring them 3 times, right? The 40-year-olds, when they're 40, when they're 60, and when they're 80, we're measuring them. So I forgot I didn't show you that. And then table 10.2 actually summarizes the strengths and weaknesses of both longitudinal and cross-sectional. This is a really great chart that just kind of puts everything in a nice little format for you guys to compare each of the ones we just talked about. And so the last thing that we want to talk about is what's called cross-sectional longitudinal designs, which sounds completely contradictory. because we just said they were different things. But this is when you are comparing the results obtained from separate groups, like the cross-sectional design, but they were obtained over time, like a longitudinal design. They were obtained at different times. So they weren't all obtained at the same time. That snapshot, it was over time. So the example that they gave in your book is talking about the researchers returned to the same college to survey freshmen every 10 years. So you can see it was a separate group of participants every time they measured, unless somebody stayed enrolled as a freshman for 10 years, which is very unlikely. So it was a different group of participants every 10 years. It was a different group of participants. So it's that cross-sectional between subjects part. But then because it was the samples were obtained at different times every 10 years, that's the longitudinal component of it. And so this is an example of examining the development of phenomena other than individual aging. We're able to do it without looking at just individuals as they age, because again, the between subjects part is in there. So this table 10.3, this shows you, it's a summary of all the non-experimental and quasi-experimental designs that we have discussed. So in the last several videos. So you can see there's a between subjects category and a within subjects, category column. Remember, the between subjects are the non-equivalent groups. The within subjects are the pre-post designs. And then you can see if they're non-experimental, it's the differential research and the pre-test, post-test design, and it tells you what they're comparing, what they're doing. And then you can see there's also a post-test only non-equivalent control group here that is talking about. So the two non-experimental are differential and post-test only non-equivalent control group for between subjects, and then also the cross-sectional developmental design falls under between subjects as well. And then within subjects, you see the non-experimental again is the pre-post test, and also the longitudinal developmental design that we just talked about falls within subjects as well. And then it notes up here that each quasi-experimental design is created by modifying the non-experimental. So remember, we were able to make that pre-test, post-test non-equivalent control group design by adding the pre-test to the post-test only design. And then we were able to make the time series design by replacing the single pre and post scores in a pre-test, post-test series of measurements. And again, remember, those are ways of trying to minimize those threats to internal validity that the non-experimental studies have. So let's go ahead and do our learning check real quick for this section. A research study evaluates changes in behavior related to age by examining different groups of individuals, with each group representing a different age. So different groups, that should be your red flag, and different age. So that means it is a cross-sectional developmental design. Again, because they're different groups, so between subjects, and they're different ages. So that's a cross-sectional. And then the research study evaluates changes in behavior related to age by examining one group of participants who are all roughly the same age at different times. So again, one group, same age at different times. That's longitudinal. Again, because it's the same group as they age. And then a cross-sectional developmental design is an example of which general category of research. And so hopefully you realize that's the non-equivalent group, because it is a between subjects design. If you need reference, go back to that 10.3 table we just looked at. Remember, the pre and post test and the time series and the interrupted time series, those are all within subjects designs, because you're measuring participants multiple times. Whenever you're just measuring them one time, again, that snapshot, that cross-sectional, that's snapshot, that would be a non-equivalent group design. Okay, Let's see. Let's go back to here for our last knowledge check. Strengths and weaknesses of the longitudinal developmental design. What is the major strength is what they're asking here for longitudinal. And hopefully, from what we just talked about, that with longitudinal, you don't have to worry about cohort effects or generational effects because it's examining one group of people over time. So you don't have to worry about them representing different eras of time or generations or anything like that. And you can also actually see how a single person how they change as they age, which is usually what we're trying to look at when we talk about age. We want to know what's going to happen as we get older or as a person gets older. And so that is a major strength of the longitudinal design. And that is it. So if you guys have any questions about 10.4, I'm here.